Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Majo, and in this video I want to particularly talk about having a career in psychology as an international student. You've come to the UK, as it was my case. You study your conversion masters in psychology with BPS accreditation. So what are your options after that? I've received a lot of questions around this. Are you a psychologist after this conversion course? The answer is no. Or what can you do after your conversion course as an international student? Well, there are a lot of options, but I want to center the video first the things that as an international student, unfortunately, we cannot apply or we cannot have access to after the psychology conversion course, which is the famous NHS funded traineeships. You basically work and you study at the same time. You can do this, but what you need to do in order to even be eligible to apply to these types of funded roles is you need to have unrestricted right to work in the UK. So what does this mean? This means that you cannot be on a graduate visa in order to apply for these roles. You cannot also be in a sponsored visa, which is a skilled worker visa. So in other words, you basically need to be not an international student. You need to be someone local or someone that has a UK passport and restricted right to work. So before mentioning all of these alternative options, if you're an international graduate from a conversion master's in psychology or even from a bachelor's in psychology, you're in the UK, you cannot access these NHS funded. But first of all, if you haven't heard of these NHS funded programs, what are these programs? So one of them is the psychological well-being practitioner route. You basically study, you work at the same time. This is NHS funded, which means you get a salary, and at the end you get a qualification of psychological well-being practitioner. So this is not the only NHS funded psychological profession training program. There are various others, and I'm just going to put them in this screen so you can have a look through what am I referring to. So I'm talking about adult psychotherapy, associate psychological practitioner, child and adolescent psychotherapy, children well-being practitioner, clinical associate in psychology or CAP, clinical psychology, core counseling training, cognitive behavioral therapy training, education mental health practitioner, family and systemic psychotherapy, youth intensive psychological practitioner, and a few more. The only one that is really not NHS funded is counseling psychology, which means that both locals and international students need to pay to access the 3-year counseling psychology degree that is a requirement to be a counseling psychologist. But the others, the ones that I've mentioned, actually locals can access through the NHS in order to be funded and to be trained in these psychology professions and be qualified at the end. But what about international students? They cannot really access straight away to this NHS funded psychology professions trainings due to the reasons that I've explained. But as I said, there are alternative pathways for us international students in order to still use psychology and maybe build up more experience before maybe eventually figuring out if we want to pursue clinical psychology and go through the 3-year doctorate, which actually is also NHS funded. So by then you would have to have an unrestricted right to work in the UK before even considering applying to the NHS funded doctorate in clinical psychology, unless you want to fund it yourself. But it is quite expensive to do this. That's the same with counseling psychology, but with counseling psychology there's no other option than funding yourself, so you can go ahead and do that as well. But what about work experience before going on to these trainings? Because not only for us to be able to feel more confident before applying to the program, but also because they are very competitive and they actually demand that students that apply, even with unrestricted right to work in the UK, for example, they have to have experience in the niche of psychology that they are applying. So for example, I will put the example of educational psychology because it's the sector that I'm mostly interested in, but feel free to research the sector that most interests you in psychology to see what kind of work experience do you need to get in between your course, your conversion course, and in between applying to the further studies. So Educational psychology, as I've done in another video, deals a lot with schools, deals a lot with students, usually students that have some learning difficulties, deals a lot with teachers, parents, etc. So there are roles that are typically called assistant educational psychologists that you can apply as well. But the thing with these roles, in my personal opinion, is that the salaries are usually low, and they don't compensate usually for the living situation or the living costs especially in a city like London. So another alternative could be working for a non-for-profit. So I'm not saying that non-for-profits are always a high-paying salary, but they are an okay salary for you to get experience whilst finishing your conversion course and maybe considering applying to further studies in the route that you've decided. Non-for-profits usually deal with people that are vulnerable, sometimes young people, sometimes adults. They have barriers, mental health, physical impairment, something that is not allowing them perhaps to thrive. So you can work as a support worker, you can work as a learning advisor, or you can work as an employment advisor. And the third one, the employment advisor one, was the one that I did, or that I chose to do after my conversion course. So I work with people with barriers, and I help them sometimes tackle those barriers in order for them to attain sustainable employment. So that was the first role that I attained after graduation in a non-for-profit. And then, which is the thing that I'm doing now, is higher education sector. So the higher education sector, there are obviously academic and non-academic stuff. So I am in the non-academic stuff. So what I do inside this spectrum of non-academic stuff is I work with students, helping them achieve their career goals. So these students, the ones that I'm working now, are not necessarily with complex barriers like they were in my non-for-profit that I used to work for. But I still can use some coaching techniques or coaching skills or mentoring, like they call it, in order to help them thrive and perhaps use those transferable skills for the time in the future that I decide to apply for a further study in educational psychology. If you're interested in getting a role or getting a job in a non-for-profit, my tip number one is, well, of course, be constant in your applications, etc. But the website that has helped me loads in getting one role in this sector is charity.com. So you can go into that website and you can filter between paid and volunteer. I would suggest, if you are in the capacity, volunteer for some time or even parallel to gain some experience in the things that you want to do for the long term, whether that's working with mental health in a mental health charity. There are so many roles in volunteering as well, and of course apply to the paid ones. But if you feel that you need maybe a bit more experience in your CV before actually nailing that interview or getting that role, I would suggest definitely volunteering and charity.com. Now, the other route that doesn't involve working in a non-for-profit or even higher education, but still might be in the mental health spectrum, is studying a PhD. So you can look for a PhD. You can apply to a PhD without necessarily having unrestricted right to work in the UK. You can be international students. Actually, there are loads of international students usually doing PhDs. You can use the website findaphd.com. You can do research, yes, if you love research, in something related to psychology, something related to mental health, and you will still be using perhaps more the research part of psychology, but in something that, if you are passionate about psychology, you get to be in that, spectrum. Another thing to consider would be other postgraduate courses. Okay, so if you study psychology, conversion or bachelor's, and now you want to work in mental health, you've tried volunteering, perhaps you've tried maybe a paid role, but if you actually want to get qualified, maybe not psychology, but something related to well-being, something related to applied mental health, and an allied psychology field, you can search what other types of postgraduate courses could allow me to gain more practical work experience in these fields, applied mental health, etc. So for these, I would recommend the website findamasters.com. For example, you could gain a master's or a postgraduate in social work that will blend very nicely with your background academic in psychology and maybe enhance your opportunities of attaining these roles of social workers, student support worker, or these roles that usually deal with vulnerable people. Sometimes these masters or these postgraduate courses, they do include a placement or a work experience bit embedded in the course that actually might allow you to get that practical expertise that you might be missing in order to get into these applied mental health roles that you're aiming at. So there you go, you have several routes to consider in order to improve your skill set as a psychology graduate that not necessarily include applying to the NHS funded psychology professionals training programs. That was very long. Perhaps you're not able to fund this place and you're an international student, and in order to access the funding you would need to be a local or have unrestricted right to work. Then your last resource, or at least in my head, or the list of options that I've mentioned, of course they're based in the UK, but it's good to also think about even other places, other countries. So you can take your course, your conversion masters in psychology that you've done in the UK, and you can do the equivalence for the bachelor's in psychology in the other country that you're thinking. That doesn't mean that, perhaps depends on the country of course, that you will be a psychologist straight away. I don't think it will work like that, but it will definitely have a sort of value if you go through the process of doing the equivalence. And you would just have to research about all the requirements, etc., in order to become a registered psychologist in that new country that you've put your mind to. But I will leave that for future videos, or even questions that you leave me. What other countries have you thought would be interesting to study psychology? So that was the end of the video. I know it was a lot of information. Let me know what other alternatives do you think that I haven't mentioned perhaps, or that you're currently doing as a psychology graduate. In what sectors are you working? Are you using psychology in your roles? And what are your next steps, or what are you thinking about attaining with these roles? Are you mostly interested in the non-clinical side of psychology, which is like the organizational psychology, or are you mostly interested in being like a clinical psychologist or educational psychologist like myself? Feel free also to DM me, as I always mention in my Instagram, my psych journey abroad. I try to answer the questions that people sometimes leave me there. And until then, I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.